and Professor Seyed Marandi, who joins us now from the University of Tehran. Professor Mohammed, thank you as always for joining us. It's difficult to know where to start, and it will be difficult to know where to end because events are moving so very fast. But they're not going well for what we might loosely call the West. They're not going well for the West in Africa, where the effort to declare havoc and unleash the dogs of war on Niger, first called for by President Macron, appear for the moment to have failed. How do you see the situation there?
I think as the situation deteriorates for the West, and this has been going on for a very long time, the United States was really at the top of the world after the Second World War. And since then, there has been a general decline in the sense that the economy of the United States relative to the global economy gradually grew smaller percentage-wise. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think at least for a decade, people thought that the tide had turned and the United States would be the only superpower, or hyperpower, and that we'd reached the end of history. As we all recall back then, people speaking about the fact that liberal capitalism was the final phase of human evolution. But after 2000, after a decade, we saw the perpetual wars. We also saw the economic crisis in the United States and in Europe. And after that, the decline of the United States, I think, increased the rate of decline very rapidly. And the wars served as a catalyst. And so now the United States and the West, as it is called, they no longer have the ability to control the world as they did in the past. And we are seeing Latin America slip away from the United States. We're seeing Africa slipping away from the United States. And the case of Niger is, I think, extra important because of the role that it plays in providing France with uranium and energy, and providing Europe with energy at a time when the West has sanctioned so many different countries and it has limited sources both for oil, gas, but also uranium. So the more the United States and the West try to control the world, the more the world is slipping away, or they are losing control over different parts of the world. And we are reaching a very interesting phase, because I think we've actually reached the end of an empire, but at the same time, it is probably the most dangerous phase because empires do not want to lose power.
But you're a professor. If you had a student that persistently turned in work that you had already shown to be wrong repeatedly, you as a professor would be very unhappy. And yet imperialism has turned out to be a very poor student too. Just rapidly thinking, while you mentioned the Second World War there, the United States has not won a war since 1945, and it wasn't the United States that won the war in 1945. If you go, this is now the anniversary of the Korean War, 70 years from the end of the Korean War. If you look at the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan most recently, now in the Ukraine, they keep using the same tools, even though those tools are increasingly shown to be defunct. Their tools being sanction everybody, make war and invade where we have to. But these things are backfiring, as you say.
Yes, I think one professor once said that uh, this would be madness when a student would constantly, or when they would constantly repeat something that just simply does not work. And you're absolutely correct. The United States was at the top of the world because they had the largest economy, but also because they controlled the narrative. Otherwise, we know that in the Second World War, the Soviet Union played a far more important role in defeating Nazi Germany, and we know that the atrocities committed against China by the U.S. ally today, Japan, was uh, greater than the atrocities that were committed against civilians in the heart of Europe, Russia aside. But we don't ever hear acknowledgement of that. We don't hear acknowledgement of the role that the Soviet Union played. We don't hear how the Chinese suffered. Millions of Chinese were murdered, and of course Koreans as well, by the Japanese, who are now U.S. allies. So, but even I believe that the U.S. is also losing control of the narrative, because in the past, uh, we learned about the world through the West, even in Iran, which is a revolutionary country anti-imperialist. But most of our news would traditionally come from Reuters or CNN or the New York Times, and it would be translated into Persian. And so we learned about China, we learned about Latin America, we learned about Africa largely through Western eyes. And from my travelings to different countries, conferences, I saw that the same was true when it came to Iran, in Russia, in China, in our region, in Latin America. People knew about Iran largely through Western eyes, through Western media, through Western narratives. But that is changing, because now we are seeing how local economies, as they've grown, alongside them, local media has grown. And right now you see a thriving. When I went to uh, uh, Venezuela and Cuba, I saw that they had their own media that had influence across Latin America. I'm not saying that the playing field is now level, but what I'm saying is that the balance of power has been tilting away from the West, especially since 2001, at a very rapid pace. And as things continue, as we move forward, I think that this is going to continue, and I think it's going to become even more rapid, because I personally believe that there's going to be a point where you have a collective understanding that the West is no longer in charge. And when that happens, I think there will be a lot of changes taking place simultaneously across the board, even though as we speak, the changes that we're now speaking are extraordinary. And we see right before our eyes how the West is losing control. But I think in the not so distant future, it's going to become even more become even more interesting.
Now, I haven't read the story. I only saw it on my screen literally as the show was beginning, and I don't, of course, buy the Sunday Times or pay their paywall. But it turns out that it's not Russia or China that is Britain's biggest threat. It's Iran. Do tell us what fiendish plans are in store for us.
I think the problem that the UK and the United States have with Iran is that they never forgave Iran for gaining independence after the revolution in 1979, but also because of the fact that they support the apartheid regime, the Israeli regime. In other words, Western calculations in our part of the world are based on Israeli interests, not on British interests, not on American interests. And the fact that the Israeli regime is facing so many problems, both within the Zionist supremacist community inside Israel, but also they're losing support across the West. We see polls indicating that people are beginning to better understand, and many young Jews are growing hostile to the apartheid regime as awareness grows. And in our region, we see how the Israeli regime is weakening. It no longer controls its borders. It no longer controls the West Bank. It doesn't control Gaza. It's having a great difficulty subjugating the Palestinian indigenous population, and it no longer is able to impose its will outside of its borders. So as the Israeli regime becomes more concerned and more fearful of all the challenges that it faces as an apartheid regime, I think that causes more concern for its backers in the West. Otherwise, what problem does Iran pose for the British or the Americans? The Iranians are protecting their borders. The Iranians are expanding trade and business with neighbors. We've had rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Relations with other countries in the Persian Gulf are improving. You would think that under these circumstances, if Britain and the United States were normal countries, they would welcome this and they would see this as an opportunity to invest in Iran, to cooperate with Iran, but that's simply not going to happen. And I think it's because the interests of the British people, the interests of American citizens are not the priority here.
No, they prefer the zero-sum game approach. If Iran is doing well, that means ipso facto we are doing less well. And this idea of coexisting, my two suns theory, when I say the sun is clearly rising in the east, but it didn't have to set in the west. If we had embarked on a course of acceptance and cooperation, a multipolar world, then we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. But we are in a pretty big mess here in the West. Anyone who looks at the streets of Philadelphia, the walking dead that are hooked on drugs, looks at the 2 mass shootings a day now taking place in the United States, looks at the perilous economic position throughout the European allies of the US, knows that things are not going well. No one's thinking this is a glad, confident morning in the West, Professor.
Yeah, and George, we always have, let's keep this in mind. I mean, your viewers, yourself, myself, that the United States is not facing any sanctions. And these scenes that we see in the United States, you can't see them in China. You don't see them in Shanghai or Beijing. You don't see them in Moscow. You don't see them in Tehran. I've never seen such scenes anywhere in Iran. I'm sure Iran, despite all the sanctions, despite the brutal and barbaric sanctions that are intended to bring ordinary Iranians to their knees, despite all this, I mean, there are many difficulties and shortcomings in Iran. But you don't see these scenes despite all the difficulties. But in the United States, which is supposedly, as American leaders like to say, the greatest country in the world, these scenes, when we see them, it's extraordinary. How could such a country, which claims to be the land of the free and the home of the brave and an exceptional country and the greatest country on the planet, how could it allow its citizens to live in under such horrific conditions, yet at the same time it wants to have the Ukrainian young men die in the hundreds of thousands for a lost cause, and Ukrainian women to increasingly be a part of the sex trade across Europe and North America? When we look at this, the Americans seem to me, and to many like me, as really the most immoral country on this planet, and to be very blunt, the most incompetent, because when a country which after the Second World War had so much wealth and power, the scenes today, after less than a century, are just unbelievable. These are scenes that we don't, as I said, we don't see in the countries that are sanctioned, but we see in the country that is trying to create misery and despair across the world.